Unlock the power of your mind. This is Provocative Enlightenment with Eldon Taylor.
Thank you for joining us today and welcome. This is an hour devoted to learning something more, not just about the world of shoes and chips and sealing wax, but about how, what, and why we think and believe as we do. An hour for the open-minded, willing to challenge some of those old ideas behind what we think we know, who we are, and who we might become. I'm Eldon Taylor, and this is Provocative Enlightenment. And our chat room is open, and my partner Ravinder awaits you there now, as she does each week. You can log on by going to Eldon Taylor, that's ELDONTAYLOR.com/chat. So, Ravinder, say hello to the folks and let us all know what's happening in your chat room today.
Well, hello, everybody. Do come join us in the chat room. We have lots of fun, lots of conversation, and a great more depth to the radio interview itself. So there's a whole bunch more. If you're not there, you are missing out. It's eldontaylor.com/chat.
All right. Every week I read some of your letters as our way of paying respect to the very important role you play in making this show successful. 2 weeks ago, we had Dr. K. Paul Stoller on the show, and we're still receiving letters. Well, he discussed messages from the other side. Last week, I read a couple of dissenting letters to the information Dr. Stoller shared. To that, Cindy wrote, "Dear Eldon, thank you for reading my comments on the air. I understand your response and thinking, and if I wasn't constantly getting divine wisdom, I would agree. You are very wise and have accomplished so much, and for that reason I have a challenge for you. Over the next year, just think about the power of love. Look at our world in which love is tossed aside and we solve problems with everything but love. Currently, your response is, of course, the way almost all humans think. Be provocative and try and find ways to prove love is the answer. If you stand behind your current beliefs a year from now, be sure you are not turning a blind eye to the way you affect the world. Look at the way animals are treated for consumption. Pay attention to what you buy so that you are not adding to the sweatshop problem. Do they judge the degree of bad, or are there levels? There is only love. The pain of acting in any other way is punishment enough. Our universe was built with only love energy. There is nothing stronger, and that is the only way to rehabilitate and bring about heaven on earth. Our world is changing, and by the time I pass at about 85, I will see heaven on earth. Keep being provocative, Eldon. Think of all the crazy people that have changed our world. You are a voice that needs to be heard, and you need to continue to challenge all thoughts. I am a messenger, and sometimes it seems corny, but when I really sit back, it makes perfect sense. We are all one. I will not judge or write the rules. Love energy can do the impossible, and someday we will put it to the test." Now, I must admit, I would love it if Cindy were correct about this earthly school we participate in. Remember, last week she made it clear that there is no punishment for any activity, anything that happens on this plane. Well, I replied to her this way. "Thanks for your thoughtful response, Cindy. You are offering an ancient form of monism, one championed by brilliant men such as Shankara and Spinoza. There are problems in this philosophy, at least in my mind. As a former criminalist, I assure you there are evil folks in this world. I'm sure they were created of and by love, but that is not who they are today. If love created a world in which there is absolutely no consequence for actions, such as those by Stalin and Hitler, then I'm afraid love doesn't earn any respect from me. We may come from love, but given our free will, we do not always make loving choices. Our cultures, our decisions, our philosophies, our beliefs, and so forth may lead to what we might think of as a heinous act. Take, for example, the case where a 14-year-old girl is sold by her father in a culture that approves of this, fails to please the man who bought her, so he cuts her nose and ears off and discards her to the stable. Again, a culture that approves of that behavior. Not only in my mind is this behavior reprehensible, but it must also have what we think of as karma-laden consequences attached to it. or we have no ethical or moral imperatives at all. And as such, why not do whatever pleases you? Let the animal instincts prevail and abandon the need to find socially acceptable ways to act out our primitive desires. Instead, just go for it. There's an obvious flaw to this logic, unless we are willing to roll back our history and embark once again on a strict survival of the fittest basis. If, on the other hand, you wish to argue that social rules, mores, morals, and ethical standards exist only to provide strength to the weak among us, and thus end the tyranny of the despots, the stronger, then again you are insisting that this world's value system is contrived and unnecessary, except as a preservation of the species formula. In other words, if God or love created this world just to play, no schooling, nothing to learn, just experience or whatever, then our purpose is only to get the game on. I'm afraid that doesn't fly for me. Further, we were not created only as pure love for some reason, or our choices would all be only love. We all have a shadow, so perhaps we sometimes need to learn the lessons of tough love. My opinion, for what it's worth. Now that said, I will try to invoke more love and acceptance in my life. Indeed, I work at this every single day. However, I know what temperature it is by looking at a measuring device, the thermometer. I know what time it is by looking at another such device, my watch. And I can tell much about a person by looking at their measuring device, their behavior. Doing this is not judging time or temperature or person. It is rather discerning a condition. If discernment suggests this person is asleep to love, to divine potential, as say the behavior of the unnamed, I'll leave him unnamed, man who shot a school bus driver and kidnapped a 6-year-old child and then hid the child in his homemade bunker, then I will discern the need for correction and not be concerned that I am somehow acting against the divine love that created us all. Now, I reflected on Cindy's comments most of the past week. In the end, my thoughts distilled in this statement. Mankind has killed perhaps 100 million of his fellow kind. No other species behaves this way. What arrogance, then, is it of man to believe he deserves a God? And what an absolute audacity it is to conceive of his God as only love, in whose image man was created. And yet, I have seen the highest quality of humanness, and therefore I must continue to believe in the awesome potential of every human being to become only love. As Paul Harvey might say, now you've heard the rest of the story. Okay, moving on. Last week our show featured Joanna Andros and Tanya Chernova, and we discussed their book, Undermined. Amy wrote, excellent show, Eldon. Loretta wrote, wonderful show today. Made me think about what I have been truly thinking subconsciously. I will purchase the book, and having Dr. Eldon Taylor writing the foreword, I know it will be very helpful. Thank you so very much, Dr. Taylor and Ravinder, for having such wonderful guests on your program, and keep it up. Well, keep it up. We'll continue to do, and thank you very much, Loretta, for your letter. Mava wrote, Dr. E, another great show. This is something I've been working on in my life. It's been a bit frightening to come face to face with the things I believed about myself. What's worse is the fact that I wasn't even conscious about these beliefs. Your inner talk works have been immensely helpful to me in changing these beliefs to something that actually works for my life. You are on the list of people for whom I am eternally grateful. Wow, I'm truly honored and humbled by your words, Mava. Thank you. Deborah wrote, I'd like to tell you that I just finished reading What If, and I thought it was wonderful. Thank you for all your thought-provoking questions and situations. As I read, I kept thinking how great this book would be in the high school classroom. So I showed it to my teacher friend and former mentor. She teaches peer mediation classes, and I know this book would be a wealth of lessons for her students. I plan on buying her a second copy for her use in her classroom. Well, thank you, Deborah. And there are a couple of classrooms that are using the book now. Kelly wrote, I recently finished reading your book, What If? The Challenge of Self-Realization. It's a book that I think ought to be mandatory reading for all young adults. I spent most of my adult life thinking I believed in things that, only after many years and much examination, I realized weren't my true beliefs after all. You might say that I was under the influence of the herd mentality, never knowing who I really was. The fact is, I believed what other people told me I should believe, my teachers, my parents, even the faces on the nightly news. It has only been in recent years since I become actively involved in discovering my true self and in maintaining a close relationship with God and my own divine spirit that I've realized the great difference between who I really am and who I always was told that I am. For many years, I let other people tell me what position I should hold on global issues as well as in my personal life, and I did not even know that I was allowing myself to be programmed. Now I ask questions that I never would have before, questions that in the past I'd have never asked because I thought they contradicted with what I should believe. Even if the person I'm listening to is widely regarded as a spiritual leader or guru, I make it a practice to listen to my true inner voice, trust my gut feeling about whether something really rings true in my heart or not. This book asks all the questions that I've asked myself during these years of introspection and spiritual growth. I hope many people read this book and make it a practice to ask themselves, is this a belief that I hold, or is it just what I've been told? Thank you, Eldon. Much love to you and yours. Well, and much love right back at you, Kelly, and thanks for your wonderful letter. Ravinder, how many people do you think What If has alienated as opposed to how many people have written us wonderful letters?
I think it's probably 50-50.
That's what I think, too. And if you look at the book reviews, that's true. Now, so listen, everybody out there. If you have not read my book, What If? My challenge is get a copy. Check it out from the library or order one. It's cheap. And see if you can read it, experience the 20-plus thought experiments, and still come away believing as you currently do. However, if you accept my challenge, you must also promise not to hate me when you're through. And I say that simply because the book is intentionally written in a way with thought experiments deliberately designed to arouse strong feelings, because without them, we can't see into ourselves. Not about my opinions, it's about discovering your own beliefs. All right, that's all the time we have for letters today, but I do invite you to opine by sending your email to eldon@eldontaylor.com or by joining me on Facebook. We can't get all of your letters on the air, but they do impact our programming, and once again, I both appreciate and thank you for your feedback and continued support. Now to today's show, Immortal Yearnings, Mystical Imagings, and Primordial Affirmations of the Afterlife with Dr. Annamaria Hemingway. Dr. Hemingway writes, quote, as human beings, one of the greatest challenges we all face is coming to terms with the devastating death of a loved one. After experiencing a tragic loss in my own family, I was inspired to research the mystery of death and discovered a wealth of invaluable knowledge. My goal then became to write a book that portrays how the darkness of death can provide a torch of illumination for the living. Close quote. All right, let me tell you a little bit about our guest. Annamaria Hemingway, Ph.D., is a writer, workshop presenter, and spiritual counselor. She is the author of Practicing Conscious Living and Dying, Myths of the Afterlife, and Immortal Yearnings, and a member of the International Association for Near-Death Studies and the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences. Her work is centered on coming to a greater understanding of mystical states of consciousness, including that of the near-death experience, to suggest that these life-changing events may reflect a primordial affirmation of death and rebirth that has existed throughout the evolution of human consciousness in many different forms. Dr. Hemingway was with us in January 3 years ago, and we received quite a bit of letters, or quite a bit of mail, I should say, many letters, regarding our discussion of her Conscious Living and Dying book. Now, I must tell you in advance that I may be biased regarding today's discussion, for when I saw an advance copy of her book, I offered this remark. I have just read the best book I have ever read regarding life after death. I strongly urge you to enjoy exploring Immortal Yearnings. So on that, let's get her in here. Welcome back to Provocative Enlightenment, Dr. Annamaria Hemingway.
Hello, Eldon. Nice.
How are you today? We haven't chatted in a long time.
We haven't. Well, except for email communications. But yes, good to be back with you.
It's good to have you. Before we get into your book and the interview today, do you want to weigh in at all on whether or not there are consequences to our behavior here on this plane when the time comes that we do cross over?
Well, I think when we talk about the afterlife or an apparent afterlife, we have to bear in mind that everything we think is a conjecture because obviously we don't really know. Right. But what we do know for certain is that people in a near-death experience, for example, do have a life review, and that forms an integral part of their experience. And in this life review, one is given the opportunity to look back over life. And a lot of people, are not so happy with things that they've done or said or even thought. And certainly when they return to everyday consciousness or everyday life, one of the marked transformations is, as one lady put it, I decided I didn't really like that movie and thought I'd make another one. Mm-hmm. So I think that, a lot of karma or judging good and bad behavior, which is certainly featured in an awful lot of philosophers, debates as well throughout the ages, is that the person themselves, has to live with the consequences of their life. And I think as well as passing over to the other side and maybe having consequences from whatever actions we choose in life, we also have to live this life on Earth. And if we're living with that kind of energy inside us, I think, we see the results in the escalation in modes of behavior that people choose to try and compensate.
Let me put this to you this way, if I may, Dr. Hemingway. I have read NDE accounts, and I've read other reports that suggest that Stalin, reviewing his life review on the other side, would experience so much pain. It would be as though he were feeling the pain that he inflicted on all those he inflicted the pain upon. He would be experiencing this not because someone was doing it to him, like he's being beaten, but because that's the nature of the correction process to the other side. Does that make any sense to you? With your research, does that fit?
Well, I think it does because, we hear a lot about near-death experiences that are positive and, the images are beautiful and transcendent. But we don't hear so much, or perhaps we don't dwell so much on the people that report negative near-death experiences. And, their images are not so pleasant. They may be all the most horrifying images that, one can imagine. But again, some researchers suggest that when a person goes through the tunnel, and we have to remember that going into the light does involve going through a dark tunnel, so it's a very symbolic tunnel. And the reason that some people may experience, what's termed to be a negative or very frightening near-death experience is because they get stuck in this tunnel. And this tunnel actually represents the shadow side of human consciousness, not just their own. So they get caught up in this vast, dark, horrifying and frightening space.
Yeah, what Zimbardo called the Lucifer effect.
Yes, I mean, often that actually will turn into a more benign experience, either a helper of some kind or some divine image will appear and draw them out of that tunnel. And sometimes the person themselves actually finds themselves, maybe for the first time in their life, praying or asking for some divine assistance. And I think what's more interesting, in a way, is that, we often think that these experiences are obviously spiritually based, meaning that in order to have one, a person must have some kind of religious affiliation. But that's not always true, and certainly even atheists actually report near-death experiences. And so I think it doesn't discern, an experience like this doesn't discern amongst people who may be Christian or maybe Muslim or maybe Jewish or maybe say, I'm an atheist, because we all get drawn into the same journey, if you like.
That's very interesting. And I want to pursue that some. And I also want to ask you about how you handled your own tragic loss. But since you brought up the atheist, you spend a good deal of time in your book talking about, philosophy and psychology and of course, the common denominator that we will call archetypes. And I'll have you define that a little bit clearer later. But one of the things that I noticed that was, interesting, I'll say that. Sigmund Freud is one that you refer to in his work with dreams and his belief in the unconscious and the importance of understanding unconscious theory. And yet at the same time, Freud wrote Future of an Illusion. Freud believed that religion, a belief in God, was, quote, a sugar-coated neurotic crutch. So here's a man who spent a lifetime, a man who collaborated with Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, a man who defined psychotherapy, gave us concepts or constructs such as the shadow, who for all intent and purposes was an atheist. How does that square with taking evidence of archetypes and using that evidence to advance the idea that there's an afterlife?
Well, one interesting fact that perhaps a lot of people aren't aware of is that as Freud approached the end of his life, he was to state that he wished he had spent more time investigating religion for himself. So I think, when we talk about near-death experiences, we tend to imagine, because they are emanating from a mystical state of consciousness, that we can't almost mimic that same journey here on Earth. And my belief is that we do.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to hold it right there because we're coming up on a hard break. I don't want the computer to shut us down and suddenly there's a commercial running. When we come back, we'll pick it up right there. You're listening to Dr. Annamaria Hemingway. We're discussing her wonderful book, Immortal Yearnings, Mystical Imagings, and Primordial Affirmations of the Afterlife. Her website is courageousliving.com, courageousliving.com. If you're not already in our chat room, now's a great time to join the conversation at eldontaylor.com/chat. Be sure to stay tuned. You don't want to miss what's coming up after a few words from some of our friends.
Unlock the power of your mind. This is Provocative Enlightenment with Eldon Taylor.
And welcome back. If you just joined us, we're speaking with Dr. Annamaria Hemingway about her wonderful book, Immortal Yearnings. But before we get back to the show, I do want to remind you of the upcoming I Can Do It conference in Vancouver, Canada on April 20th and 21st. I will be presenting there along with many of your favorite authors. So if you can join us, please do. This will be a weekend that you will not forget. You will find all the details at hayhouse.com and on my homepage at eldontaylor.com. Do try to come. All right, let's get back to the show. First of all, before the break, I sent you to the wrong website. Let me get that corrected. You go to AnnamariaHemingway.com. That's ANNAMARIA, Hemingway, HEMINGWAY.com. AnnamariaHemingway.com. That's where you want to go. All right. Now, Dr. Hemingway, you suggested before the break that Freud may have had second thoughts about his atheism. And, you know, I'm not sure about that. I do know that he suggested that belief in an unseen God may prepare the groundwork not only for science and literature and law, but also for intense introspection. And as such, I know that he became very interested in the study of that during his last few years in England. But he, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, they seem all at times to be able to recognize that religion was more of poetry than perhaps it was an opium of the people, which was something they had said earlier in their careers. Now, that said, I guess, do you think that the evidence of the archetypal nature that you have come upon offers something that compels us to believe in a life after death, or is it really addressing a psychology that is our need to believe that we're more than just mortals destined for dust?
Well, that's a big question.
You're the boss. You tell us.
I think certainly to begin with, the nearest that we come to experiencing any notion of life after death is certainly in the near-death experience, because people obviously are very firmly convinced. And, you know, interestingly enough, we have to take into account that not all of these people may have had any beliefs previously. Recently, Dr. Alexander's near-death experience has been in the news a lot, and one of the reasons is because he was a scientist, he was a surgeon, he was a person that would not have entertained the near-death experience validity until it happened to him.
But isn't that a conscious issue itself? I mean, unconsciously, as Freud would have argued, we don't consciously deal with death. And that often can cause some of the repressed feelings that we deal with and some of the mechanisms that we cope with, because we don't, in fact, you discussed this, we discussed this together the last time you were here. We don't look at death consciously. We don't explore it consciously. We shove it into the background. And then we deal maybe with thanatos urges, but and I don't mean to disagree with you. I'm only asking, is it possible that indeed, even though our neurosurgeon was a scientist, he nevertheless was predisposed unconsciously by the same thing that we're all predisposed, and that's this notion that, you know, mortality is something that we all will face.
Yes, that is true. But, you know, I suppose, enlarge this whole idea of a near-death experience into encompassing the fact, which is the one that mainly fascinates me, you know, and I research into, is that this is a dramatic picture of life after death. But I firmly believe that that the near-death experience, dramatic as it may be, is actually just an example of what I call a primordial affirmation of death and rebirth that actually, usually unconsciously, but nevertheless, follows us through life, whether we take it from the natural world around us or whether you even look back to Freud and you see that Freud's office was covered in Egyptian and other early cultures' antiquities. And these already in his life, had kind of attracted him. One of the reasons that they did attract him was because they were full of images and symbolic meaning that goes back to this primordial affirmation of death and rebirth that was kind of held much more in consciousness by ancient civilizations. So while consciously we might wipe that out, I think unconsciously we're surrounded, and every now and then we get stirred by these affirmations, if you like. We build many of our religious monuments to reflect all these kind of beliefs. It's almost as though we have custodians of a primordial knowledge that we now are not so familiar with in our own lives, but nevertheless they do resurface in different ways. One of them is the dramatic example of the near-death experience. But again, I'd also like to reiterate the fact that although the near-death experience is very interesting to people who want some kind of proof of life after death, what it actually involves as well is a spiritual death and rebirth. And that spiritual death and rebirth means that that particular person returns to their own life transformed. So it's not just to do with this idea of passing from one state of being to another. It's actually, becoming reborn, if you like, but in the spiritual sense. And many ancient philosophers, including Plato, used this idea of a near-death experience, which again is not new. We can go back thousands of years and hear similar stories, which, again, a lot of people may not be aware of. They may think, well, there are lots of resuscitation methods available now, so more people make it. And, because of the use of drugs and hallucinations of the dying brain, these people come back and they conjure these vivid stories that obviously for them were true, but may have been the result of other agents. But actually, we go back thousands of years when these things didn't exist, and we realize that people were having the same experiences anyway. But of course, they weren't so widespread and written about the way they are now because people didn't have those tools of communication. They didn't have internet or, Oprah Winfrey or things like that.
Right.
So really, we have to sort of look at and trace a whole pattern, not look at just specific incidents.
Right. Now, when you look at near-death experiences as you have, and I hear, we've gone from Greece to the Mesopotamian area, Egypt, etc. Have you found a cultural diversity with respect to the reported NDE experience? I'm not talking about how the people changed when they came back, but what it is they reported seeing.
Well, I think if we can put this to begin with in terms of our own cultural upbringing, we have certain religious faiths, and those faiths are often embodied in certain figures. So if one were in England, for example, it, would probably be Jesus Christ. Other parts of the world that have different images would imagine something else. They might imagine Allah, or they may imagine a Hindu god, or even a Hindu goddess. And so that's kind of where the realm of the archetype comes in, because when we talk about an archetype, we're talking about, again, a primordial energy, and that's reflected in different images that people have of that same energy. So even though a person will have exactly the same kind of sequence of events, for example, perhaps if they saw a religious figure, it would be donned in the guise, if you like, of their particular, cultural heritage.
Right.
And so the core sequence remains the same, but anomalies occur around that person's mythological, for want of a better word, because, I like to stress the word mythological is not referring to something that's made up. In this sense, it's referring to, a body, a legacy of ancient wisdom, if you like. So, yes, their journeys will be slightly different in accordance with those belief systems, but the actual, the actual experience itself will encompass the same core parts to it as any experience, and that includes a person who's an atheist. Perhaps they could see their grandmother, because that was the most important person to them,
Right. So it matters not to you, by way of credibility, that, say, someone in the Western world today is going to go through a tunnel where some of these earlier reports of NDEs, it was the ferryman that was taking them down the river. Mm-hmm. That matters not to you at all. That those differences make no difference to you. Is that correct?
No, because if we look upon it as symbolic, whether it's a tunnel or a body of water, what we're talking about is something to cross over or pass through. The symbol is what it is, a symbol, whether it's a bridge, a body of water, a dark tunnel. It's representing this transition from one state of being to another. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we need to look at, really, is not the actual image that's described, but what that image actually, is symbolic of.
Okay, which leads me to, and I probably should have had you do this before, define what how you use the word archetype. You clarify that for us.
Well, as I just said, I think the simplest way of understanding an archetype is that there are primordial energies, and if one were to take, for example, something that happens all the time, the alternating pattern of light and darkness, we would call that an archetypal energy. They're sort of like indelible footprints, if you like, that have been, marked in the human psyche that we recognize, like you were talking about a shadow. Mm-hmm. Well, we all recognize what that shadow archetype embodies. It embodies a hidden, sometimes malevolent, from your beginning introduction to the show, you were talking a lot about that. And so we understand what the shadow means, and we might project that onto, say, the shadow side of the moon. So we see lightness on one side, and we imagine darkness on the other. And Jung himself, who investigated this realm of what he called the collective unconscious, gave certain names to certain archetypal energies, like the wise old man, the shadow, the persona of the image that we present on the surface to people, And so we kind of have this realm of archetypal energies that we embody onto, different images that we recognize and associate with those energies. Like we might have the Earth Mother embodied in all sorts of, various goddesses from many different cultures. And when we look across the spectrum of civilizations, we see that even though, as I said before, travel was not just getting on a plane to the other side of the world as it is now in a matter of hours. It wasn't telegraphing or emailing or Googling information. And so it's very interesting to see that in all of these different places in the world, human beings came up with the same kind of images. And they shaped and formed these images, with their own cultural belief systems. Right. But we find these same kind of archetypal figures existing throughout all of them. Like, every ancient civilization had an Earth Mother. Some of the most kind of oldest artifacts excavated are images of the ancient Earth Mother, from very simple ones to ornately decorated, beautiful works of art. That image stays within our collective consciousness as we travel further into consciousness.
Right. Now, the devil's advocate position, however, to all of that would be to say the common denominator among all people is fear. And to placate that fear, to assuage that anxiety, to deal with that unknown death, we create myths. We create stories that assuage that anxiety. And so we have explanations for the children about the great mother whose womb raises the food that we eat, otherwise we would starve, that gives us the water, and so on and so forth. We have myths about what happens to our dead. We have rites of passage, and that's the common denominator. And that's why, whether it's going through the tunnel or it's Shuran, the Greek guide, the stories will differ, but they're driven by the same root cause. To that, Dr. Hemingway, what do you say?
Well, I say, what am I going to say? What I would say is that, that's all very well. I would personally look at that as a horse with blinkers on, because one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, well, okay, all these people were just sitting around in different areas of the world, and they wanted to work out, something to combat fear. But where did those stories come from? Why are they all so similar? Why are they all so similar from so many different places? Where did people get the wherewithal to even invent those stories? That would be my question. And, that I think actually that takes some reflection, because one would really have to delve into the interior being to try and find an answer to that question.
But conceivably, we all have imaginations. We all invent boogeymen.
Yeah, well,
we all invent
where would
things.
imagination come from?
Imagination itself. That's an interesting question. Where would it come from?
Well, I would suggest that it could possibly come from some transcendent source. Imagination, in a way, is we all have imagination. We all look at things in ways, and we translate them.
But
we look at poets, we look at mystics, we look at painters, and we see that they're looking at the same picture, and they see something entirely different, and they convert that, or translate it, or transcribe it, or, create images of that. And then when we look at that, and we gaze at it, and we contemplate for long enough, and we empty our minds, we can gaze in front of some masterpiece, and suddenly something clicks open, and we see what they saw.
True. But isn't that begging the question to say the evidence for NDE is that the imagination that may have possibly accounted for it was given by divine, and therefore NDEs are evidence of divine? I don't know. I'm just going to throw that out there. Let's leave the subject. I want to pursue what you're saying about...
Well, I would just like to say I think there's two kinds of imagination. There's the imagination that we gain from our five senses, and there's also an intuitive or sixth sense, which often, brings not a higher imagination, but a more transcendent imagination, what, ancient mystics would have called an awakening or an epiphany, that suddenly you're looking at the same thing, but it looks entirely different. You've seen something else that you didn't see before. And, we can't sort of prove any of these points, but what we can say for certain is that does happen. An artist will paint a picture of the moon because he's trying to convey something that has come into his awareness. And we may not have that same vision, are granted a glimpse of that vision, because through that piece of work, we too are transported somewhere beyond just our five senses.
One of the reasons that I've asked you some of the questions that I have today is to emphasize, to bring out the fairness, the openness with which you wrote this book, the research and the insight that you've combined in it. I genuinely find Immortal Yearnings to be the best book I've read on the NDE experience. Now, what then is the bottom line, Dr. Hemingway, from all of your work that you would most like to communicate to others in about 1 minute that we have left?
Well, I think what I would like to convey to people, which is what I'm actually researching and writing on now, is that we don't have to have a near-death experience to experience similar revelations, if you like, because these experiences obviously do reveal something to the person that's had them that is greater than their ordinary everyday awareness. We just have to step outside and really look at our surroundings, from the leaf on a tree to anything. We have to really actually live in this life as part and parcel of nature and not as something set apart. And I think that would change people's viewpoints. It might sound sort of a very simple thing, but it's something we don't do anymore. And it's a place where we can all reconnect with something greater than ourselves, whether we believe in near-death experiences, religion, or anything else. We cannot fail to...
and we need to do that. And I'm sorry, we're just out of time. The website is AnnamariaHemingway.com. Do check it out. The book is Immortal Yearnings. We've come to the end of another hour here at Provocative Enlightenment. I want to thank you all for listening today, for joining us, and for the feedback that you share with us every week. I hope you enjoyed our show, and I hope you will join us again next week, same time and same place. Until then, wherever you are in the world, remember, believing in yourself always matters.